this lecture, we're going to take a look at England in the 17th century, moving towards modernity. On the right, you see a map of England, 1644, to give you a basic reference. And then on the left, you see several essential questions. How did the Tudor arrangements of the 16th century affect the Stuarts of the 17th century? There's going to be a change in dynastic families that rule England. And I think you know that Queen Elizabeth died a virgin queen, therefore had no children. So there's going to be another family, that's the Stuart family, Queen Mary of Scots. In fact, it will be her son, James VI of Scotland, who becomes James I of England. So how did the Tudor arrangements, however, that is politics and cultural arrangements, then affect the Stuarts? And that'll be an interesting question to investigate. Was it politics or religion that caused the troubles in England that led to civil war? So we're going to see that, again, this confluence, or this overlapping of religion and politics that is going to, in fact, cause intestinal troubles yet again. So there should be a fairly familiar pattern to everybody at this point. And then lastly, an interesting question, I think, is why does understanding the Civil War matter all that much? And I think that there are some lessons for us to be learned from how things played out in England and what happened. So we're going to move on. Just want to start briefly with a kind of a reminder. What did the English nation look like politically? And it's somewhat unique in that we have a monarch, or the monarchy, that is the life of the court, that is the king, his great nobles who supported him, the royal council who advised the king, and then we had the parliament, or what we'll call the political nation, that's made up of the House of Lords, who are the great noble families themselves, and then the House of Commons, who would be the merchants, and particular merchants, lawyers, bankers, etc., who met in the House of Commons. And one of the great things that the Parliament did in England traditionally was it voted on all taxes that were then provided to the king and to the court to carry out the official policies of the nation of England. So Parliament has a very key role in the nation of England that is unique, I think, in Western Europe. And what we're going to do is keep that in mind, because what we see in the 17th century, once the Stuarts become the new ruling dynasty in England, we're going to see considerable tension and then open conflict between the court and the parliament. And the question then you might ask is, well, how did that come to be? And one of the things I think that we can just briefly mention is that the Tudors, Henry, then Edward, and Mary, and Elizabeth, were in large part successful because they were able to work with Parliament. So pursue the interests of the Tudor family and dynasty, but also work with Parliament. That is, they didn't alienate Parliament, thus causing tensions. That's something that the Stuarts were going to have a hard time doing. So before we do anything, though, I want to look at these 6 problems of royal rule. And these are problems that some historians have identified with royal rule, and in particular the royal rule of Henry VIII, whom you see pictured there. And these 6 problems are the royal personality, royal control or sovereignty, royal finance, religion, foreign policy. Number 6, the number disappeared, but dynastic succession. And we kind of want to take a look and start with Henry VIII, who, as you know, was an influential monarch who reigned from 1509 to 1547, and he really kind of set the tone for the court and for the monarchy. And he set the bar rather high for all who followed him. So let's take a look. Henry was a larger-than-life figure, and he had no problem claiming to be a god on earth. And this is something that, simply put, his children could not follow him in. Elizabeth came close, though a woman. She didn't really equal Henry's stature and prominence as queen. And this was going to lead to some serious discord once we see the Stuart family becoming the new monarchs in England. There's going to be a problem of personality. So Henry's reign is somewhat successful, though there were issues obviously surrounding his reign in terms of his oversized ego, his spending habits, his wars. He had a personality, however, that matched the occasion, and that I think made him somewhat successful. And that's not going to be the case for the Stuart monarchs, who are going to struggle with this problem of royal personality. And I think it's true that the success of the court in early modern Europe really in large part depended on the personality of the king. And one wonders whether that still holds true today in politics in the contemporary age, whether the personality of a person, in fact, is more important than a person's handle and or grasp of substantive matters. The problem of control. Henry, though a very powerful monarch, larger than life, as you see pictured there, rather relied on parliamentary legislation to help him settle the religious affairs in his life, and he used Parliament to separate England from Rome. And so in this way, Henry is sharing power with Parliament. So, for example, the Act of Supremacy of 1534 that made Henry the head of the Church of England was done through Parliament. That is, not through royal edict or fiat rule. And so religious settlements in England are going to be passed through Parliament. We'll see this again in 1559 with Queen Elizabeth and her religious settlement. And so this really leads to a fundamental question, and that is, who's really controlled in England? The monarchy or the court? The political nation. And again, there's going to be an answer that kind of blends both the monarch and the court, though when we get to the Stuarts in the 17th century, we're going to see that the problem of royal control became one of the central issues that led to open conflict and later civil war. Let's talk about the problem of royal finances. England, English kings that is, could only tax subjects with the approval of Parliament. Now, Henry himself, king, spent a lot of money on wars. He spent a lot of money on palaces. In fact, some 60 palaces that Henry owned and or possessed. He spent a lot on the navy. He spent a lot on artwork. He spent a lot on wars against Scotland and France. And Henry was always starved for money. And what Henry did was, when he separated from the church, he took church lands and monasteries and he essentially sold them off to the gentry, that is the lower aristocracy, to make money. So Henry made a lot of money quickly, but he didn't really capitalize in full on the value of these church and monastic lands that he had confiscated. And had he done so, he might have been able to set England on the path to long-term financial economic stability. But he didn't. And so what happens is debts will accumulate over time. And I think, we hear about debt even today as being a problem that many nations struggle with and face, including the United States. And Henry then leaves to his successors this problem of debt, which becomes a weakness. And this is going to be something that we see with the Stuart kings again, that is going to drive the Stuart kings into conflict with Parliament as they need revenue to fund their policies and their court life. We're going to look at now the problem of religion. So Henry tears England away from Rome, but Henry never really promoted any kind of religious settlement of any substance. It was rather under Elizabeth that England opted for a religious compromise settlement. That is, in 1559, we had the idea of Protestant doctrines largely linked to Calvin and his ideas about the faith and theology. Yet England also, in a strange way, kept a lot of the Catholic hierarchy, that is, the organization of the church from the top down, starting with the Archbishop of Canterbury and then other bishops to organize and really run the church, including the appointment of ministers in various parishes. The liturgy, that is, the order of the service, was also very similar to the Catholic Church. So we had what I'll call a politique settlement that blended the Protestant doctrines with the Catholic practices, the way people actually practice religions. And this was really meant to calm tensions between ex-Catholics and the Church of England. Now, one of the things that I think nobody really expected was that this settlement in England of 1559 led to opposition from within the Church of England itself, when a small group of Church of England followers felt that the settlement was that it allowed for the continuation of too much Roman Catholicism. And the term I'll use is popery. So there's too much popery in the Church of England. And this small group of people wanted to purify the Church of England by eliminating all traces, that is, all vestiges of the Catholic way of prayer. And this group, as you know, are the Puritans, and they're going to grow over time in number, and this is going to cause a problem of royal control. So we're going to see how religion links back to the idea of royal control. So this is going to, again, be a problem for the Stuarts. The Stuarts, who are themselves Protestant, Calvinists from Scotland, come to England, yet they encounter in the Church of England this movement of people called the Puritans, who want to reform even more, to a greater extent, the Church of England. So that's going to be something that is going to cause significant problems. In the realm of foreign policy, we see that Henry was fighting wars against the Scots, against the French. Later, Elizabeth would be fighting wars against the Spanish, and this really occurred after the death of Queen Mary of Scots in 1587, and also because Queen Elizabeth had sort of rejected King Philip II of Spain's marriage proposals, so that there is this idea that the Spanish Habsburgs are going to launch a full-scale assault on the English nation to defeat that, to remove Elizabeth from power, and to restore England to the Catholic faith. Of course, that all fails, the Great Armada, yet the Great Armada of 1588 didn't end the war. It simply was the beginning salvo in a series of wars that would last all the way down to Elizabeth's death and beyond. So the idea of foreign policy is going to itself link back to royal finance. Wars are quite expensive. The kings need to rely on parliamentary grants of tax revenues to fight these wars, which will then limit in some way the royal control, because kings are now relying on parliament. So you can see how these 6 problems of royal rule become very interconnected, but help us understand, I think, and I hope, some of the issues and challenges that are going to come to the fore, again, especially after the Stuarts ascend to the throne, starting in 1603. And then the last one is the idea of the problem of succession. And that really is going to be, again, I think that's quite simple to understand. Elizabeth doesn't have children, she's not married, and then who takes over? And it's really the Stuart family that had claims going back to Henry VIII's sister, Margaret, who had married into the Scottish dynastic family, the Stuart family, and so it's the heirs of that marriage that will then come back to England as the Stuarts in 1603. So if there are any questions at this point about the 6 problems of royal rule, please jot them down and bring them to class. So let's turn our attention now to the new monarch, the new king, and you see him here seated. This is James I, who becomes King of England on March 24th, 1603. And he had already been the King of Scotland. His title there was James VI of Scotland. And he becomes the king in 1568, although he's only 1 year old at the time. But he does grow and becomes the king in his own right and rules for a number of years. So James actually had quite a bit of experience as a king, and that's going to be really useful. And I think when James the First became king, there was a reason to celebrate in England. He was a male, after all, following Elizabeth. He had experience as a king, so there are great expectations that he'll be able to rule effectively. He was a Protestant. And that was going to work well with the English religious settlements, and he also had several sons, so the idea of dynastic succession was not going to be an issue. So things looked up in 1603 for England, and it would seem that James was capable of negotiating the difficulties of the monarchy and the court, and also the parliament. However, the feeling, the great expectation would not last long, as the problems of royal rule began to become evident and drove the court and parliament into open conflict, the Civil War. So one of those things that we want to focus on first is the problem of personality. James, having ruled in Scotland in a more absolute way without a parliament, didn't ever really understand Parliament fully, and he was maybe even jealous of Parliament. And Parliament itself, it is going to act to defend its own rights and liberties. And so by 1604, there had already been a falling out between James and Parliament over the episcopal structure, that is, the hierarchical structure of the Church of England, and the argument was over bishops appointing priests and ministers in local parishes. And this is something that James insisted on, the right of bishops to appoint ministers and priests in local parishes. And the Parliament took a dim view of this, and in fact wanted this practice to end. So right there we have tension over religion, 1604, the year after he becomes king. And in 1605, James is going to do something that sort of startled the English nation. He arranges a peace treaty with Spain, known as the Treaty of London. And so the war ends, and one might think, well, that's good. This is peace. This is a good thing. And in fact, James would often work for peaceful settlements to conflicts with other nations. Yet this caused a great deal of suspicion on the part of the English people, who felt that James was, in fact, too peace-loving. And I think what we see here is possibly that idea of red-blooded nationalism on display by the English people, who wanted to use the wars as a way, as a vehicle to promote English unity, and the English identity, that is the national identity, something later we'll call nationalism. So I don't think it's fair to call it nationalism just yet, but there certainly seems to be a great deal of suspicion that the new English king seems to be more interested in peace than in fighting wars. Another problem of personality was the fact that James himself had great pretensions of being a divine presence on earth, whose power could not be challenged, could not be contested. And in fact, he wrote a very famous pamphlet about this, entitled The True Law of Free Monarchies. Now, that's all fine and well if James had been more like Henry VIII, but he wasn't. James was not an imposing physical presence like Henry VIII. He had a large head, he had small spindly legs, in a time when nice plump muscular legs were a sign of power. He spoke with a lisp, and he also seemed to have a predilection for young men that many textbooks like to point up and play up as though he might have been a closet homosexual. I don't think that really matters all that much, but the idea that does matter is James certainly didn't seem to fit the profile of this divine-like king that he claimed, in fact, to be. And it's rather interesting that a person's physical appearance and or personality would, in a sense and in effect, matter. And again, does personality matter? And we can ask that question today in our political world. Does personality trump any other considerations about our leaders? Sorry to use the word Trump. So James's high opinion of his power also led him into conflict with Parliament. The English Parliament had been in existence for several centuries. It was an independent body, increasingly made up of Puritan members in the House of Commons, and these Puritan members in the House of Commons began to really question the idea of a divine monarch, and they began to challenge that idea. And what James would do, as his son who followed him would do, when things didn't work out with Parliament, James would simply dissolve Parliament. And that is, in fact, one of the rights and privileges of the king, who could, as executive of the English nation, actually dissolve the Parliament. That is, send them home so that they would no longer be able to meet. Now, that's a problem of royal finances, though, because if you send Parliament home, how do you get taxes to fund the royal court initiatives and policies? So you can see, again, there's an interconnectedness between this. And it really is, I think, in part religious differences that are going to fuel the conflict, but it's also financial and tax revolts that are going to fuel the conflict. And in the end, these things will bubble over into civil war later in the 1640s. So at this point, again, if there are any questions about James, and I'd also like to add that James was also fond of living the good life, having fun with his courtiers in terms of entertainments, parties, and hunting, and, playing that role of king and court that really, again, did not sit well with the Parliament. And again, the Puritans, who increasingly make up the House of Commons, are hard-working people who delay gratification to some time in the future so that they can conduct their business with a great deal of seriousness and thrift. And they see this king who seems to be more intent on spending money, or rather squandering money, in these frivolous affairs. And so, again, I think there's some cultural differences that begin to emerge that also, together with the religious and the tax-based financial issues, begin to push England into a situation where there's going to be open conflict. And at that point, we can, if you have any questions about that, please jot them down. Now, I'm going to end the lecture here just by stating that the conflict between monarch, and that is the court, and Parliament, really begins to take a turn for the worse once the 30 Years' War begins in 1618. And it's from 1618 right through the 1620s that there were a series of issues that led to what I will call acute political polarization. And I don't know whether that term sounds familiar to anybody, but it should, because we live in an age of acute political polarization ourselves. And that polarization is really going to, again, it's worth repeating, be caused by, in part, religious issues. It's going to be caused by foreign policy and war. It's going to be caused by financial issues. And so we see that the confluence of these events is going to drive England into a state of chaos and then civil war. And it's really the outcome of that civil war that we're interested in studying. And you might wonder why the events of the 30 Years' War in the Holy Roman Empire, England's not connected to Europe, why this would be of interest to James. And it's really because James's daughter had married Frederick V, the Elector of the Palatinate. So James, in a way, is coming to the aid and defense of his daughter and son-in-law in 1618 and then in 1620 to try to help them defend themselves from the Catholics and the idea of the Catholic League. And that's really going to begin to drive James and Parliament in opposite directions. So with that, I'll stop the lecture here. And if you have any questions, again, please jot them down, and we'll pick up the next time.